There is a studio that exists at the edge of memory, though studio is the wrong word for it, and perhaps there is no right word because what we're speaking of is not a building or an institution, but a constellation of worlds, each of them complete in itself, each of them touched by the same quality of attention, the same patient reverence for small things, for the way light falls through kitchen windows and the way wind moves through tall grass, and the way a child's hand closes around the handle of a door she has never opened before. You have been to these worlds already, some of them, in the drifting hours before sleep, in the quiet spaces between one thought and the next. You are returning to them now, not as a viewer, but as a traveller, as a scholar of places that were never quite real and never quite unreal. Places whose histories are worth knowing slowly. There is no urgency here. There is no rush. The worlds have been waiting, and they will go on waiting, and you may wander through them at the pace of your own breathing. Let the kettle whistle. Let the rain come down. Let the worlds begin. Before any of the worlds there was the soil from which they grew, and the soil was the long, quiet countryside of Japan in the decades after the great wars of the 20th century. A country learning again how to look at itself, learning how to hold the old and the new in the same hands without breaking either of them, and out of that learning came a particular way of seeing that would shape every world the chronicles now preserve. It was a way of seeing that refused to separate the ordinary from the miraculous, that treated the arrival of a bus in a village and the arrival of a forest spirit in that same village as events of equal reality, belonging to the same fabric of what the world contained, neither more nor less deserving of careful attention. The chroniclers who carried this way of seeing forward were not always in agreement about what they were doing. Some of them believed the work was about the preservation of something that was being lost, the small pleasures and rhythms of rural life, the cooking of a particular kind of fish, the sound of cicadas in the heat of the late summer, the way old houses creaked at night in a language of their own. Others believed the work was about flight, about the places the world opened into when one gave oneself permission to leave the ground, whether by aircraft or by broom, or by the simple act of letting a feeling carry one somewhere one had not intended to go. And others still believed the work was about spirits, about the unseen populations that filled the corners of every ordinary place, the kami of the hills and the rivers and the rice fields, the old gods who had never gone away but had only grown quieter, the way grandparents grow quieter in rooms full of children. What united the chroniclers, across all of their disagreements, was the conviction that no world was worth building that did not begin with a kitchen. This was a conviction so deeply held that it operated below the level of argument, expressing itself in the way every story began with someone cooking, or eating, or carrying a bowl of something warm to someone who needed it. The kitchen, in these worlds, was the place where the real work of the world was done, the work of keeping bodies fed and hearts attended to, and any heroism that took place outside the kitchen was understood to be a temporary departure from the kitchen rather than an escape from it, a journey undertaken in the full knowledge that one would return to a waiting meal and a familiar face and the particular forgiveness that waits on the other side of any long absence. This was not sentimentality. The chroniclers were clear about that. Sentimentality flattens its subject, makes it smaller and sweeter than it is, and the kitchens of these worlds were not smaller or sweeter than they were. They were exactly themselves. They held the smell of miso simmering in the late afternoon, the sound of rice being rinsed in cold water, the quiet rhythm of chopping that marked the passage of a domestic hour, and they held also the grief that gathered in such rooms when someone was absent, and the tenderness that gathered when someone returned. From this soil, then, the worlds began to grow, and they grew in many directions at once, some of them reaching toward the forests of the deep past, where the spirits still walked openly and the boundaries between human and animal were thinner than they have since become, and some of them reaching toward the clouds, toward floating islands and airships and the long blue spaces above the ordinary world where a different kind of freedom was possible, and some of them staying close to the ground, close to the villages and the seaside towns and the small apartments in large cities, where the quieter kinds of magic unfolded in the quieter kinds of lives. The chroniclers did not attempt to unify these worlds into a single map or a single history. They understood that such unification would have been a betrayal of what the worlds actually were, which was a plurality, a scattering of distinct places, each with its own weather and its own spirits and its own particular relationship to what the word home meant. The listener who travels through the worlds in turn will encounter this plurality directly. the journey is not a progression from one world to the next along a line of connected geography. It is more like the wandering of a guest through the rooms of a very large house, each room opening onto a different country, each country entire and complete in itself, each door closing softly behind the guest as she moves on. What the worlds share, across their great diversity of weather and landscape and era, is a set of recurring presences, a cast of figures who appear again and again in different forms, as though they were not characters belonging to particular stories but deeper patterns that the stories were shaped to accommodate. There is, in almost every world, a child who must carry something too heavy for her, and who carries it anyway, and who is changed by the carrying in ways that the world around her struggles to fully acknowledge. There is, in almost every world, an old woman who knows more than she says, whose kitchen or cottage or shop functions as a threshold between the ordinary and the uncanny, and whose quiet authority holds the story together at the moments when it might otherwise come apart. There is, in almost every world, a wounded god or a wounded forest or a wounded sky, something vast and ancient that has been injured by human carelessness, and that is mourned, even as it is feared, by those who understand what its injury means. And there is, running beneath all of this, a single persistent question about the relationship between the small and the large, between the domestic and the cosmic, between the kitchen where the soup is being stirred and the forest where the spirits are dying, a question the worlds do not answer in any final way but that they return to, again and again, with the patience of people who understand that some questions are not meant to be answered, but only held, gently, for as long as one is able. And so the soil settles, and the worlds begin to take shape within it, and the first of them rises through the mist as a forest older than memory, where the spirits still walk on legs that have not yet learned to be invisible. The forest that rises through the mist in this first world is not a forest as the modern imagination understands forests, not a reserve or a managed woodland or a place that has been allowed to remain wild within boundaries set by those who decide such things. It is older than any of those categories, than any of those. It belongs to a time when the word forest was indistinguishable from the word world, when to walk out of one's village was to walk into something living and conscious and unbounded, something that watched the walker with 1,000 kinds of eyes and held her within a logic that was older than any human understanding of what logic was for. The chronicles of this world are careful to preserve this sense of scale. They do not describe the forest as a backdrop against which a story unfolds. They describe it as the primary inhabitant of the country it covers, the senior presence, the one whose patience and whose memory set the terms under which everything else, including the humans, were permitted to exist at all. The humans of this country lived in the small pockets of clearing that the forest had allowed to open within itself, the way a great sleeping body might allow small warmths to gather in the folds of its resting. They built their houses of wood taken with apology from the edges of the forest, and of stone taken with greater apology still from the rivers that ran down out of the forest toward the distant sea. They grew what they could in the thin soils of the clearings, and they gathered what they were permitted to gather from the forest's generosity, which was considerable in seasons when the forest was calm and altogether absent in seasons when the forest was mourning something the humans could not see. It was understood that the forest mourned. It was understood that the forest rejoiced in its own slow way, and that it grew tired, and that it occasionally grew angry, and that none of these moods belonged to any single tree or any single spirit but belonged instead to the whole of it, the way moods belong to a person rather than to any particular cell within that person's body. The spirits who moved within the forest were many, and they were organized, if that is the right word, into a loose and shifting hierarchy that the humans had learned to read only partially. There were the small spirits who attended to small things, the guardians of single stones and single pools, the shy presences who kept watch over the nests of particular birds or over the graves of particular animals. And these spirits were numerous and generally benign and given to a kind of playful watchfulness that the humans found companionable when they encountered it at all. There were larger spirits who belonged to rivers and ridges and groves of a certain size, spirits whose moods carried consequences that the humans had learned to take seriously, and there were larger spirits still who belonged to entire valleys and entire watersheds, spirits whose names were not spoken except in circumstances of great need. And above all of these there was the presence that the humans called simply the Great One, or the Walker in the Forest, or by other names that varied from village to village, the presence whose arrival in a clearing was accompanied by a silence so complete that the humans who witnessed it remembered the silence long after they had forgotten everything else about the encounter. The Great One walked at the boundary between day and night. In the long blue hour when the forest held its breath, and what followed in his wake was the slow changing of the seasons, the deepening of the green in spring and the withdrawal of the green in autumn, the quiet instruction that moved through every growing thing and told it when to flower and when to sleep. He was not a gentle god. The chronicles are careful about this. Gentleness was not among the qualities he possessed, nor was cruelty, nor was any of the qualities that humans might have wished to assign to him in order to make him comprehensible to themselves. He was older than comprehension, and he carried life and death in the same hand, and where his antlers brushed against the trunks of old trees, those trees stood a little taller, and where his hooves touched ground that was dying, the dying was permitted to complete itself rather than being interrupted or prolonged. The humans who lived at the edges of his country had, over the long centuries, arrived at an arrangement with him that was not exactly a treaty, and not exactly a prayer, but something more like a careful domestic quietness, a set of observances that acknowledged his presence without presuming upon it. They did not hunt in the deep groves where he was known to walk. They did not cut trees beyond the narrow band of forest that the forest itself had offered them. They made small offerings at the thresholds between their villages and his country, bowls of rice left on mossy stones, folded paper tucked into the roots of particular trees, songs sung at particular hours that the children learned before they learned their own names. The arrangement held for longer than the humans had any way of measuring, and it held because both parties understood that the cost of breaking it would be greater than either could bear. But the world beyond the forest was changing, as worlds do, and the pressure of that changing pressed inward upon the old arrangements in ways that no single human chose and no single spirit could resist. Iron had come into the country many generations before, and with iron had come the need for fuel to work the iron, and with fuel had come the slow, steady hunger of furnaces, which is a different hunger from the hunger of any single person or any single village. The furnaces did not stop being hungry when they were full. They did not know the difference between the fuel that could be spared and the fuel that could not. They required what they required, and the humans who tended them came, over time, to be shaped by the requirements of the furnaces rather than shaping those requirements themselves, which is what happens to any people who place a hunger larger than themselves at the centre of their common life. And so, into this country, came the settlements of the ironworkers, built in places the forest had not offered them. Growing by increments the forest had not sanctioned, sending small parties deeper and deeper into the old groves in search of the harder woods that the furnaces preferred. The spirits watched this happening with the slow attention of beings who had watched many such beginnings before. Some of them withdrew further and deeper into regions that iron workers could not yet reach. Some of them remained, and grew quieter, and waited to see what the humans would choose. And some of them grew angry, in the slow way that forests grow angry, and their anger began to gather in pockets and hollows of the old country, thickening like weather, waiting for the point at which it would have to be released. The chronicles do not pretend that this gathering was a simple story of virtue and vice. The ironworkers were not villains in the simple sense. They had come to this country because the countries of their birth had been closed to them, because they bore illnesses that other communities had refused to tolerate, because they were women who had been sold into arrangements they had found means to escape, because they were men who had lost the wars they had been born into and had nowhere else to go. The settlement they built was in many respects more generous and more egalitarian than most places the humans of that age had managed to build. It fed those who had been hungry. It protected those who had been threatened. It gave dignity to those whose dignity had been taken. Everything that made it a home to its people was real, and everything that made it a wound to the forest was also real, and the chronicles hold both of these realities in the same hand without pretending that either one cancels out the other. What came of this holding, in the long centuries that followed, was the slow unfolding of a grief that was not yet finished unfolding when the chronicles themselves were compiled. The forest did not heal quickly, the humans did not learn quickly, but the arrangement that held the two together, though damaged, was not entirely destroyed, and the small, quiet observances that had shaped the old country continued, in diminished form into the ages that came after, carried forward by those who remembered, and by those who had only half remembered, and by the children who would one day walk into the deep groves and feel, without being able to name it, that someone very old was still watching them and had never quite stopped. And so the forest holds its grief and holds its patience, and the listener may carry that forest with her as she moves onward toward a smaller country and a quieter hour, where two sisters wait at the edge of a different kind of woodland for a father who is making his long way home. The father who is making his long way home travels through a country that could not be more different from the old forest, though it lies on the same islands and breathes the same air. The trees here are not the titanic silent watchers of the deep groves. They are the gentler trees of the Japanese countryside in the middle decades of the 20th century, the camphor and the zelkova, and the old cedars that villages have kept for 1,000 years, not because anyone remembers why, but because the keeping itself has become part of what the village is. The roads here are dirt roads rutted by the passage of bicycles and the occasional slow truck, winding between rice fields that are flooded to their perfect silver mirrors in the early summer and left in their stubbled gold in the late autumn. And the houses along these roads are old wooden houses with sliding paper doors and tatami that creaks when small feet run across it. Houses that have stood through wars and earthquakes and the slow, quiet passage of generations who did not feel the need to replace what had been built well the first time. Into one of these houses, at a particular bend in a particular road, a family is moving. The father has driven the borrowed truck down from the city with what few possessions the family has chosen to bring, and the two daughters ride beside him in the cab, the elder with the quiet composure of a child who has decided to be grown, and the younger with the restless delight of a child who has not yet learned that decisions about composure exist. The mother is not with them. The mother is in a hospital some distance away, recovering from an illness that the chronicles do not name with any clinical precision, because the family itself does not name it with clinical precision. The illness existing in the household is a long shadow whose shape is understood without being described, a presence that shapes every decision the father makes, and every kindness the children show one another without ever being the subject of direct conversation. The family has come to this country house in order to be closer to the hospital, and also in order to be closer to something the father has not quite articulated even to himself, a quality of older and quieter life that he hopes will hold his daughters through the long waiting that lies ahead. He's a scholar of some kind, a man whose work involves the careful reading of old texts and the careful thinking of careful thoughts, and his particular temperament allows him to treat the move as an adventure rather than a retreat, to notice the interesting architecture of the new house before he notices its dust, to be delighted by the sooty black sprites that scatter into the attic beams when the children first open the doors. "Ah," he says, in the tone of a man greeting an old acquaintance, "those are the makro-korosuke, the soot dwellers. They live in old houses that have been closed for a long time, and they go away when people come back to live there. They will not hurt you." And the children, watching their father greet the dark shapes with such calm familiarity, decide that the new house is safe and that the adventure has begun. What the chronicles of this country preserve, above all else, is the texture of ordinary days in a landscape where the boundary between the visible and the hidden has worn thin through long inhabitation. The daughters settle into the rhythms of the new place with the adaptive speed that children possess, exploring the house and its outbuildings and the little stream that runs behind the garden. Discovering the well and the camphor tree and the neighbouring farm where an old woman and her grandson make them welcome, with the unhurried hospitality of country people who have seen children come and go across many summers. The days take on a shape that is almost entirely small. There is the filling of buckets at the pump in the morning. There is the opening of all the sliding doors to let the summer air move through the rooms. There is the walk to the bus stop in the evening to meet the father returning from his work at the university. The younger sister carried on the elder sister's back when she grows tired, the umbrella shared between them when the rain begins. These are the materials from which the chronicles are made. They are not preliminary to the story. They are the story, or a great part of it, and the spirits who eventually emerge from the old camphor tree emerge not in spite of this domestic texture, but because of it, arriving to children who have already learned to pay attention to small things, and who will therefore recognize larger things when they appear. The spirit of the camphor tree is one of the oldest presences in the chronicles, though he carries his age lightly, in the manner of very old beings who have decided that dignity is less interesting than play. He is enormous and soft and grey, and he sleeps through most of the hours of most of the days in the hollow beneath the tree's great roots, emerging only at certain thresholds, in the long blue evenings or in the hour before dawn, or on rainy afternoons when the light is doing something interesting. His voice, when he uses it, is not quite a voice, being more like a great sleepy rumble that the body feels before the ears notice, and his name, as the younger sister invents it on the afternoon of their first meeting, is the name she's been whispering to herself from the moment she saw him, a name that is not in any language and yet is somehow exactly his name, the sort of name that very small children can give to very old beings, because very small children have not yet forgotten how names actually work. The elder sister meets him later, and in a different register, and her meeting is shaped by the particular anxiety that has been building in her across the slow summer. The anxiety of a child who has understood more than she has been told about her mother's condition, and who has not yet found anyone she can safely share her understanding with. When her sister goes missing on a particular late afternoon, having run off into the fields in a small confusion of grief and frustration, the elder sister's search for her becomes something more than a search, becomes a kind of desperate pilgrimage through a landscape that has suddenly revealed its capacity for danger, and the great grey spirit of the camphor tree comes to her in this crisis, not as a playmate but as a helper, summoning forces older and stranger than she had any way of expecting, setting in motion the machinery of the hidden country to return the lost child to her sister's arms. What the chronicles preserve about this episode is the particular quality of the help offered. It is not the help of heroes, it is the help of neighbours. The spirits of this country do not solve the family's problems, they do not heal the mother, they do not remove the long shadow that has settled over the household. What they do is smaller and stranger and more lasting. They offer the children an experience of being accompanied through their fear, of being held inside a country larger than their family's sorrow, and this experience becomes part of the inner furniture that the sisters will carry forward into the rest of their lives, a resource they will draw on in hours of difficulty long after the summer in the old house has ended. And the mother does, in the quiet time beyond the chronicle's own ending, come home. The illness does not close around the family. The house on the bend in the road keeps its soot dwellers and its camphor spirit and its garden that grows, season by season, into something fuller than the father had dared to hope. The sisters grow, as sisters do, in and out of the particular closeness that the summer of their meeting with the great grey spirit had given them, and they will, in the long later years of their lives, recall that summer, without needing to describe it to anyone else, carrying it as a shared private knowledge, a warm, quiet country they can return to in memory whenever the worlds they inhabit grow cold. And so the country of the old house settles into the evening, and the listener may carry its quiet forward into a different kind of coastline, where a small red-haired fish who has chosen to become a girl is pulling herself up out of the sea. The coastline where the small red-haired fish pulls herself up out of the sea is a coastline of a kind that exists in many countries and belongs wholly to none of them, a stretch of modest Japanese fishing villages clinging to cliffs above a restless grey-blue water where the roads wind between tiled roofs and tended gardens, and the wind carries the smell of salt and diesel fuel and the particular sweetness of ham sandwiches being made in small bright kitchens. The houses here are not old in the way the country house of the two sisters was old. They are houses of the later decades of the 20th century, built in brisk economical forms, painted in cheerful colours that the sea weather softens and fades across the years. And they are inhabited by families whose lives move to the rhythm of ferries and school buses, and the long careful routines of caring for the very young and the very old together under one roof. The sea beyond these villages is not the decorative sea of holiday postcards. It is the deep working sea of the chronicles, full of its own populations and its own politics, governed by currents and conventions that the humans of the coast only partially understand. Within this sea, at depths the fishing boats do not reach, there is a wizard who has chosen to live beneath the waves rather than upon them, a man who was once of the human country, and who has, through studies, the chronicles describe only obliquely, made himself into something else, something that can speak with the great sea goddess, and that tends, with the particular devotion of the self-exiled, to the health of the ocean his former kind have been so careless with. His house moves through the deep water in a drifting bubble of light, and within that house he raises his many daughters, who are not daughters in the ordinary sense, but are small fragments of the sea itself that he has shaped into swimming, speaking, curious forms, each of them a miniature person with a fish's body and a human's attentive face, and a name that she has not yet had any reason to know. The eldest of these daughters, the one whose hair is the colour of a geranium petal, and whose curiosity is greater than her siblings and greater, perhaps, than her father has prepared for, slips one afternoon from the drifting house and makes her way upward through the layered water, passing the deep dark zones and then the dimmer zones, and then the zones where sunlight begins to filter down in slanting yellow columns, until she breaks at last into the air and finds herself in a small glass jar among the shallow rocks of the shore, bewildered and delighted, and immediately in the greatest danger she has ever encountered. The jar is found by a boy of 5, a boy who lives in the house at the top of the cliff with his mother and with the elderly women his mother cares for in her work, a boy whose name is a single soft syllable, and whose particular quality is the attentive kindness that very young children sometimes possess in concentrations that adults around them cannot sustain. He frees the small fish from the jar. He names her, on the spot, with a name that is almost the name his mother sometimes calls him, and the name settles upon her at once with the quiet authority that certain names possess, and from the moment of the naming she is no longer simply what she was. She is now someone in the human country. She is the small red-haired person the boy has called into being, and she has decided, with the absolute conviction of which only 5-year-olds are capable, that she will become a girl and live with him in the house on the cliff forever. What follows is not a story in the adult sense, a story of complications and reversals and hard-won lessons. It is a story in the shape a 5-year-old gives to a story, where decisions are absolute, and affection is absolute, and the difficulties the world raises against such absolutes are treated as passing weather rather than as serious obstacles. The wizard father, discovering his daughter's absence, comes up through the sea in great distress, not because she has chosen the human world, but because the choosing itself carries consequences he understands better than she does, consequences to do with the balance of salt and fresh water in the bodies of all the creatures of the sea, consequences to do with the sea goddess and her ancient reluctance to see her daughters crossing over, consequences that ripple out from one small red-haired girl's determination into storms and tides and the rearrangement of whole coastlines. He recovers her temporarily and brings her back below the waves, and there in his drifting house he and his daughter argue with all the patience 2 very different kinds of beings can muster, and in the end the daughter's resolve is greater than the father's grief, and he lets her go because he is a good father, and because he understands that the alternative would be to hold her against her nature, which is a thing no parent who has loved a child can ultimately bring himself to do. The storm that breaks over the coast in the wake of her second ascent is not a storm of malice. It is a storm of adjustment, the sea itself working out the new equilibrium required by her choice, and the chronicles describe it with the particular attention they give to all weather, as a vast, slow expression of something larger than any single will. The waves climb the cliff beyond the house. The ferry routes are closed. The old women in the mother's care become lively and cheerful in the way the very old often become lively and cheerful when they sense that something strange is happening, the kind of strange that belongs to the country they have been half expecting to rejoin for some time. The boy and the small red-haired girl he has named are entrusted with a kind of gentle quest, a walk through the transformed landscape to find the wizard and the sea goddess, and to settle the terms by which the girl may remain, a walk that the boy undertakes with the steady grace of a child who has decided that his new friend is his responsibility, and that his responsibilities are not negotiable. They travel in a small toy boat that his mother has enchanted for them with a single quiet gesture that the chronicles do not remark upon, and they travel through a world where the ordinary has been rearranged without being destroyed, where the flooded streets are not dangerous but merely different, where the great prehistoric fish moving beneath them are not threats but companions. They pass a house where a mother sits with her new infant. They pass the care home where the old women have gone, now lifted upward in the rising water into a space that is somehow both the building they have always known and the country beneath the sea at the same time. And they arrive, in the way children arrive at such things in such stories, at the meeting place where the adults and the goddesses are waiting, and the terms of the girl's humanity are agreed upon with remarkable little ceremony. The kiss of 5-year-olds being, as it turns out, a stronger binding than many older forms of magic. What remains, after the storm has settled and the sea has withdrawn to its ordinary shore, is a house on a cliff with one more inhabitant than it had before, a small red-haired girl curled asleep against a small dark-haired boy in a nest of blankets on a tatami floor, and the mother watching them both with the calm, attentive love that has been, throughout, the true foundation of the whole story. The wizard father returns to his deep house in the sea, and the goddess returns to her greater deeps below that, and the coastal villages resume their ordinary weather, and the boy grows up, and the girl grows up, and the chronicles do not pretend to follow them into the ordinary adulthoods that follow, because the chronicles understand that the heart of the story was always the 5-year-old absoluteness of the meeting itself, the moment in which one creature named another and the naming held. And so the small red-haired girl and the boy who named her fall asleep together in the house on the cliff, and the listener may carry their quiet forward into a darker and more complicated country, where a young woman in a blue-grey dress is walking alone through a moving door into a castle that does not belong to any single place on any single map. The young woman in the blue-grey dress walks into a country that resembles, at first glance, a corner of Europe, as it might have existed in the long Edwardian afternoon before the great wars that closed that century, a country of cobbled streets and horse-drawn trams and shop windows full of ribbons and hats, of cafes whose awnings flutter in a mild sea breeze, of market squares where flower girls arrange their bright bundles in tin buckets at the foot of stone fountains. But this resemblance is a surface only. The country she walks in is not any corner of Europe and not quite any era of it, and the chronicles are careful to note that its geography is the geography of a wish rather than of a map, the particular wish of people who have imagined, across long generations, what it might have been like if the gentler aspects of that lost century had been allowed to continue without the catastrophes that in fact ended them. The result is a country that is sunlit and serious at once, a country where the ordinary pleasures of bread and coffee and well-made shoes are taken seriously as civic accomplishments, and where, beneath that pleasant surface, old magics and old wars are moving in the way weather moves, sometimes only as distant clouds and sometimes as storms that break upon the streets with very little warning. The young woman herself is not, at the moment she walks into the chronicles, anyone the chronicles would otherwise have noticed. She is 18 years old. She works in the hat shop her late father left to the family, the eldest of 3 sisters, and she is accepted with the quiet resignation of a certain kind of elder daughter that the running of the shop and the care of the hats and the long patient attention to the fussing of the customers will be her particular inheritance, the shape her life has decided upon in her absence. She is not unhappy. She is not happy either. She is a person who has put her own possibilities away in a drawer and has decided not to open the drawer, and the chronicles are clear that this closing of the drawer is not the result of any great wound, but of the steady small discouragements of a life in which no one has ever quite noticed her or invited her to notice herself. What breaks her out of this composed self-erasure is not, as in simpler stories, an act of love or an act of courage, but an act of malice, directed at her by a person she has barely met. A powerful witch, wandering through the city in search of someone she has imagined to be a rival, mistakes the young woman in the hat shop for a woman of consequence, and places a curse upon her that is exquisitely tailored to wound a person whose chief injury is that she has never felt herself to be a woman of consequence. The curse does not strike her down. It does not disfigure her in the crude sense. What it does is more interesting, and more revealing of what the witch understood about her victim. It ages her. It ages her by several decades in an instant, leaving her an old woman of perhaps 90, stooped and grey and visibly brittle, and it binds the curse with a particular cruelty by making it impossible for her to speak of what has been done to her, so that to any listener she meets, she will appear simply to be the old woman she has become, with no trace in her voice of the 18-year-old who still looks out from behind her eyes. The chronicles linger on this moment with a care that repays attention. What happens next is not what one might expect from a young woman so transformed. She does not weep. She does not panic. She looks at herself in the mirror with a long quiet curiosity, and she thinks, in words that surprise her, that the old face looking back at her is in some way more honest than the young face it has replaced, that the old face at least admits what the young face had been concealing, which was a certain spiritual tiredness that had settled upon her long before her years had any right to permit it. And she makes a decision that is the first real decision she has made in her adult life, the decision to leave the hat shop and the city and to walk out into the open country beyond the walls, looking for what she does not quite know, except that she knows she cannot stay where she has been, and that the curse, strangely, has given her a kind of permission to go. What she finds beyond the walls is the castle that does not belong to any single place on any single map, a castle that walks on 4 long mechanical legs across the moorlands and the wastes, trailing smoke from a crooked chimney and whistling slightly where its iron plates have loosened. The castle is the home of a wizard of uncertain age and considerable vanity, a young man of enormous talent who has, in the years before the old woman finds him, made a series of choices that have compromised him in ways he has not yet learned to think about honestly. He has sold away pieces of himself in the course of various wizardly ambitions. He has entered into a compact with a fire demon that has bound them both in complicated obligation. He has run from kings and from witches and from his own former teachers, and he has moved his house from one landscape to another in order to stay ahead of the various consequences he has declined to face. He is, in the language of the chronicles, a person who has not yet grown up, and his castle, in its wheezing and clattering and constantly rearranging way, is the exact outward expression of the inward state he has been unable to resolve. Into this moving house the old woman presents herself with a calm that's almost comical, announcing that she will be the new cleaning lady, and settling into the work of tidying the accumulated chaos of a young magician's domestic arrangements with the quiet thoroughness of someone who has spent 18 years in the service economy of a small hat shop. She does not explain who she is. She does not explain what has happened to her. She simply goes to work, and by going to work she begins to effect the slow transformation of the household. Not by any magic of her own, but by the older and more reliable magic of attention and steady care. The fire demon in the hearth, who has seen many inhabitants of the castle come and go, watches her with interest. The young apprentice who lives on the upper floor receives her with relieved gratitude, and the wizard himself, returning from one of his long flights in the form he assumes when he wishes to travel by air, finds her already installed in his life, already scrubbing his pots and arranging his cupboards and receiving his customers at the various doors his castle is connected to, each of which opens onto a different town in a different country, the castle itself being a kind of threshold house, a building whose nature is to open onto other places. The relationship that develops between the young woman who appears to be old and the young man who has been hollowing himself out in pursuit of his own avoidances is the quiet centre of this world's chronicles, and its character is nothing like the romance one might have predicted from a simpler version of the same story. It is not a courtship. It is more like the meeting of 2 wounded people who recognise, without ever having to say so, the particular shape of one another's injury, and who begin, by small inconspicuous acts of mutual attention, to make it possible for each of them to be less injured than they had been. She straightens his life. He, without quite meaning to, begins to give her back her sense of her own worth, not by admiring her appearance, but by treating her opinions and her presence as simply and unremarkably valuable, which is a kind of treatment she has never received from anyone before. The curse that holds her body in its 90 years begins, intermittently, to loosen. In moments when she forgets herself in the work, in moments when she's angry at him, in moments when she's asleep, she is seen, by the other inhabitants of the castle, to be briefly her own younger self again, though neither she nor he remarks on these intervals, because neither of them has yet understood what they mean. The chronicles of this country move outward from this quiet domestic arrangement into the larger weather of the times, into a war that the young wizard has been trying to avoid participating in, and that is, in the way of such wars, closing in upon everyone whether they have chosen it or not, into the politics of witches and former teachers and compromised kings, into the long reckoning the young wizard must eventually undertake with the fire demon he has bound himself to, and with the pieces of his own heart he has bargained away. And the old woman who is not old walks through all of this with the steady acquired patience of a person who has stopped being surprised by the world's largeness, and her steadiness, more than any spell cast or battle won, is what holds the household together through the rearrangement the war forces upon it. What the chronicles preserve beyond all the incident is the image of the 2 of them on a particular afternoon in a flower garden. The wizard has magicked into being between the moving legs of the castle, a flower garden that exists nowhere on any ordinary map and that will not exist in quite this form again. And the young woman in the blue-grey dress, who has at this moment forgotten that she's supposed to be old, is walking among the flowers with the wizard in the shape of a man, and the light is the long yellow light of a summer evening, and neither of them is speaking because there is nothing, in this particular moment, that needs to be said. And so the castle walks on across the moors of its own strange country, and the listener may carry its quiet light forward into a different and stranger house, where a girl of 10 stands alone at the entrance of a tunnel that will change the shape of her name. The girl of 10 who stands alone at the entrance of the tunnel has been brought to this place against her will, in the back seat of a small car driven by parents whose attention is elsewhere. Parents who have taken a wrong turn on the way to their new house, in a new neighbourhood, and who have arrived, by a route none of them would be able to retrace afterwards, at the edge of a stretch of forgotten land where an abandoned theme park sits quietly rusting in the late afternoon light. The girl does not want to be here. She does not want to be moving house. She does not want to leave the school she has attended and the friends she has begun, with the slow, cautious trust of a cautious child, to consider her own. She sits in the back of the car with a bouquet of flowers from one of those friends wilting in her lap, and she has been, for most of the drive, a small concentrated knot of resentment and unease, the particular unease of a child who has understood that her life is being rearranged, and who has not been consulted about any of the rearrangement. The country in which the abandoned park sits is Japan, in the late years of the 20th century or the early years of the 21st, the precise era left deliberately unspecified in the chronicles so that the listener may place the events wherever her own memory finds most habitable. It is a country of economic disappointment and quiet reassessment, a country in which the building of enormous pleasure grounds in the middle of nowhere had been, for a brief time, a plausible ambition, and in which the subsequent abandonment of those pleasure grounds had left, scattered across the landscape, a series of peculiar ruins whose gates and stalls and painted facades wore the particular melancholy of structures that had been built for joy and had outlived the joy's funding. The family's wrong turn has delivered them to one of these, and the father, whose temperament is the breezy, confident temperament of a man who has made certain kinds of bargains with the world, decides at once that the situation is an adventure, that the stone figure at the mouth of the tunnel is charming, and that they should all go through to see what is on the other side. What is on the other side is a small green valley that does not appear on any map, a valley containing a shuttered town of stone buildings and empty cobbled streets, where the stalls and counters of what had once been a great market stand untended, still faintly warm, as though their proprietors have stepped away for only a moment and will be back at any time. The smells in the valley are the particular smells of feast preparation, of simmering broth and rendered fat and rice that has been cooked with saffron and soy, and the parents, following the smells across the empty square, find a counter laden with food and sit down at it with the same breezy confidence and begin to eat. The girl, who's been hanging back in the street, watching with the particular unease that her long afternoon has been refining into something sharper, does not sit down and does not eat, and when she returns a short time later from a small exploration of her own, she finds that her parents have become pigs. The chronicles are careful about this transformation. They do not describe it as a punishment in the simple sense, as though the parents' appetite were being rebuked from some moralizing height. They describe it as a consequence, a revelation of something that had been true about the parents already, a making visible of the particular kind of unthinking consumption that had brought the family to this valley in the first place, and that the valley itself, being the place it is, cannot help but reveal. The girl stands in front of the two heavy pigs who were, a few minutes earlier, her mother and her father, and what she feels is not revulsion and not grief, but a vast and specific loneliness. The loneliness of a child who has suddenly understood that the adults she had trusted to manage the world have, for reasons she does not yet comprehend, stopped being available to manage it. She is saved, in the first instance, by a boy who finds her at dusk as the lanterns of the town begin to come on. A boy of 12 or 13 whose name is the name of a river, and whose composure is the composure of someone who has already been living in this country for longer than he would willingly admit. He explains to her, with the rapid, practical kindness of someone who knows there is very little time, that she must hide her fear, that she must not be seen to be afraid, and that she must find work in the great bathhouse that stands above the town on the far side of the river, because in this country any creature who cannot be put to work is at risk of being consumed by the country itself, and work is the only protection she will have until she can find a way to restore her parents and leave. The bathhouse of the country is the central institution of the Chronicles, and it is a structure of great beauty and great strangeness, 8 stories rising above the river, with a red and gold facade and a forest of chimneys and a series of bridges and walkways along which the clientele arrive at all hours of the evening and into the night. It is a bathhouse for the spirits of Japan, for the kami of the rivers and the mountains and the household thresholds, for the old and tired gods who come here from all the corners of the country they tend to be washed and rested and fed before returning to their duties. It is run by a witch of enormous age and enormous business sense, a woman with a great head and an embroidered kimono, and a roster of employees who have signed their names away to her in exchange for the work that keeps them alive within the country. The girl, guided by the boy whose name is the Rivers, presents herself for employment, and after a long sequence of refusals and persistences she receives, at the end of the night, a contract and a new name, the witch taking most of the characters of her old name, and leaving her only a single small syllable to remember herself by, a syllable that will, the girl discovers, grow harder to remember the longer she stays. The work of the bathhouse is the work of the Chronicle's slow heart, and what they preserve of this work is its texture rather than its plot. The girl scrubs floors, she carries firewood, she draws water, she learns the geography of the kitchens and the boiler rooms and the long wooden corridors along which the guests are ushered to their baths, and she learns the particular etiquette by which one serves beings who are very old and very tired, and who are accustomed to being treated with a reverence the girl's world has mostly forgotten. She is, in these first days, a small, frightened thing, but the work itself begins to settle her, as work of this kind settles anyone who gives themselves to it seriously, and she begins to find, in the steady rhythm of tasks completed, a stability that her outer circumstances have entirely denied her. What she faces, across the nights that follow, is not a single enemy, but a sequence of encounters, each of which asks something different of her, and each of which she meets with a gentleness that surprises the country around her. She bathes a spirit that has come in covered in filth, and has been taken for a mere stink god, and she discovers, when the filth is at last washed away, a great river kami whose river has been choked with the refuse of a human city, and her care of him returns him to his proper form, and he leaves her with a small bitter cake that will matter more later than she can presently imagine. She feeds a lonely spirit who has drifted into the bathhouse in a black cloak and a white mask, and when her kindness becomes confused with something the spirit does not know how to receive, she stands in the middle of his swelling grief and refuses to either flatter him or flee from him. And her refusal is the first thing that has touched him in longer than the Chronicles can measure. She carries her work into the country's further regions, across a rail line whose trains run across water, through stations that emerge briefly from the dusk and are gone, to find a sister of the witch who rules the bathhouse, and she learns, in this further country, what it is to offer one's help to a stranger without any guarantee of return, which is a lesson the bathhouse has been preparing her to learn. And she remembers her name. This is, in the end, the quietest and most important of the things the Chronicles preserve about her. Against the slow erosion of the witch's contract, which has stripped her of almost everything and is working on the rest, she remembers her name because the boy whose name is the Rivers reminds her of it, at a moment when remembering might otherwise have failed, and with her name she carries, into the final meeting with the witch, a self the country has not been able to consume. The parents are restored. The contract is closed. The girl walks back through the dry bed of the river that has flooded and receded across the course of her stay, and she walks out through the tunnel with her parents, who do not know where they have been and will not, in the Chronicle's careful silence on this point, ever know. What she carries forward is not a triumph. It is something smaller and more durable, the quiet inner weight of a person who has been a guest in a country few ever visit, and who has found, within that country, a seriousness she had not suspected in herself. She returns to the small car and the wrong turn and the new house, and her life resumes its ordinary shape, and the Chronicles do not follow her into the ordinary years that follow, because they understand that the ordinary years will be adequate to her now, in a way that they might not have been before, because she knows, somewhere beneath her knowing, that the world is larger and stranger than the small car's journey had prepared her to believe. And so the girl who has remembered her name walks out through the tunnel into the ordinary evening, and the listener may carry her quiet strength forward into a different kind of journey, where a young princess is riding eastward on a red elk through a country at war with itself, bearing a wound that will not heal by any ordinary medicine. The young prince who rides eastward on the red elk, for it is a prince and not a princess that the chronicles preserve here, does so under a burden that neither he nor his people know how to lift. He belongs to a small people called the Emishi, the last inheritors of a nation that had once held most of the northern mountains of the island country, and that has, across the long centuries preceding the events of this act, been pressed and scattered, and finally confined to a single small village, tucked into a valley so remote that most of the country beyond has forgotten the Emishi exist at all. They live quietly and well by the standards of their age, growing what their mountain soil permits and keeping the old observances their great-grandparents kept, and they have hoped, with the patient hope of a people who have learned not to hope too loudly, that the long fever of the world beyond their valley would not reach them before their own line had run its natural course. The fever reaches them anyway, as such fevers always do, in the form of a single great boar who comes down from the wooded slopes above the village one autumn afternoon, his body covered in a writhing mass of dark worms that move like flame over his hide, his eyes red and sightless with rage. He's not himself a god any longer. He had been, before the wound that corrupted him, one of the great boar kami of the northern forests, a being of considerable age and considerable dignity, and something has happened to him, in country the Emishi do not know, that has turned him into this thing of pure violence, driving him across hundreds of miles of wilderness, until at last he has broken out of the trees at the edge of the village, with the blind intention of destroying whatever he finds first. The prince, who is the last male heir of the village's ruling line, meets the corrupted god at the boundary of the fields, mounted on the red elk that has been his companion since his boyhood, and he kills the boar in an encounter that the chronicles describe with grief rather than with admiration, because the killing is necessary and terrible, and leaves upon the young prince a mark that will shape the remainder of his life. The worms that had been flowing over the boar's body pass in the moment of the killing onto the prince's right arm, and though the visible worms fade from his skin within a few hours, they leave behind a dark wound that pulses beneath the surface, and that the wise woman of the village, examining it by lamplight that evening, declares will eat him from within across the coming months. Unless he can find and address the source of the corruption that produced the boar in the first place. There is no one in the village who can tell him what that source is. There is only the old iron ball lodged inside the boar's broken skull, a ball of a kind that the Emishi have never seen, of a metal worked in ways they do not understand, and the wise woman's counsel, spoken with the formal gravity she reserves for matters of the gravest weight, that he must go west, into the country the iron has come from, and find for himself what has broken there, and whether there is any path by which the breaking might be mended. The village gathers to send him off before dawn, according to customs older than memory, and because he's leaving under the ban of a people who have always been preserved by quietness, he cuts his long hair with a single sweep of his knife, and leaves the severed braid on the altar of his ancestors. The gesture of one who is walking out of his own lineage and into a country where he will not be known. The country into which he rides is a country in the late medieval centuries of the island nation, though the chronicles are careful to treat its era with the same reticence they apply to all their dates, preferring to describe it by its qualities rather than by its name. It is a country at the long, awkward threshold between older and newer ways of living. The emperor in his distant capital is a shadow of what emperors had been. The great monastic houses that had held the spiritual authority of the islands are splintering. Warlords of various sizes and temperaments are carving up the provinces between them. And beneath all of this visible agitation, a deeper change is moving. The change that the iron ball in the boar's skull has signalled, the arrival of metallurgy on a scale the country has not previously known. The opening of mines and the lighting of furnaces and the beginning of the long process by which the forested mountains of the north and west will be transformed into the charcoal that the new ironworks require. The prince, riding westward through this country, moves through it with the careful attention of a traveller who has been taught to observe rather than to judge. He meets, in the course of his first weeks, a wandering monk of ambiguous loyalties, a cheerful corpulent man who sells him the first reliable information he has received since leaving his valley, pointing him toward a great iron town in the western mountains, where the corruption, the monk has reason to believe, has been generated. He meets along the road small groups of soldiers and bandits and refugees, and he treats each of them with the grave courtesy his upbringing has trained into him, and he discovers that this courtesy, in a country that has largely forgotten it, is a stranger and more powerful thing than he had realized, so that he passes through to dangers that might have killed a less patient traveller, because the people who might have harmed him cannot, when they have spoken with him, quite bring themselves to do so, and he comes, at last, to the country of the great forest god and the Iron Town, and it is here that the chronicles expand into their central substance. The forest he enters is, the listener may recall, the old forest whose history the earlier chronicles have already traced, the forest of the walker whose antlers brush against the trees, and the prince arrives at the hour when the ancient arrangements between the forest and the humans who live at its edge are breaking apart. He finds, at the centre of these events, two beings whom he has been travelling without knowing it to meet. The first is a young woman who had been given to the forest in infancy, by parents fleeing some calamity of their own, and who has been raised by one of the great wolf spirits as her daughter, so that she lives now at the threshold of human and animal identity, without belonging wholly to either, fighting for the forest against the Iron Town with a ferocity that the town's people have learned to fear. The second is the lady who rules the Iron Town, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and extraordinary moral complexity, who has built her town upon the principle of welcoming those whom other places reject, and who wages her war against the forest not out of cruelty, but out of the conviction that her people's survival requires the taking of what the forest had previously withheld. The prince, who has come to this country looking for the source of his own wound, finds himself unable to take a side between these two, because he can see that both of them are telling a true story, and that neither of their true stories is compatible with the other. He tries, with the patient effort of someone who has been raised to believe that disputes can be reconciled by sufficient goodwill, to find a path between them, and the country itself will not permit him to find it. The wolf-raised girl cannot forgive the town. The lady of the town cannot spare the forest. The forest god himself, whose patience had held the old arrangements for so long, is being hunted by emissaries of the distant emperor, who have persuaded themselves that his head will grant them immortality, and the prince realizes that the wound in his own arm is not separate from this hunting, but is in fact the same wound, on a smaller scale, the wound that opens when a human hand takes from a god what the god is not ready to give. What follows is the long, slow catastrophe of the forest's killing and of its unexpected partial restoration, a sequence of events the chronicles describe with the care they reserve for sacred mathematics. The forest god is shot, his head is taken, his body, searching for the head, unleashes a tide of unmaking across the country, killing the Iron Town's outer works and the old forest both, so that the chronicles, reviewing the aftermath, speak of a landscape that had been neither fully forest nor fully town afterwards, but a great flat new country waiting to decide what it would become. The prince and the wolf-raised girl recover the head together and return it to the god in the final moment, before the tide closes over everything, and the god, accepting what has been given back, falls into the waters of his own country, and is no longer, in any form the humans can recognize, present in the world. The country is returned to a kind of peace. The wound in the prince's arm is lightened, though not fully healed, and he understands by the end that it will not fully heal, that it is the permanent mark of his having lived through what he has lived through, and that the mark is not a punishment, but a record. What the chronicles preserve most carefully, after all the violence of these events, is the small scene in which the prince and the wolf-raised girl stand together at the edge of the new landscape, and agree, with a quiet that the listener may find almost unbearable after everything that has preceded it, that they will live apart, that the girl will return to the forest and the prince will settle in the rebuilding town, and that they will visit one another across the distance, because their natures will not permit them to share a single country. The parting is not tragic in the usual sense. It is the acknowledgement of a truth the country has taught them, which is that some kinds of love are not made less by distance, and some kinds of distance are required for certain kinds of love to continue to be possible. They go their ways. The forest begins very slowly to regrow. The town begins, more slowly still, to understand something of what it has cost. And the prince, riding his red elk along a new path at an unknown hour, passes from the chronicles of this country into the larger memory of the island nation, where his name is half remembered and his wound half believed, and the ordinary years that follow him are not described because the chronicles have by now made their point. And so the forest begins its long, slow regrowth, and the listener may carry its wounded piece forward into a different country, where a young witch of 13 is flying on her broom over the red-tiled roofs of a seaside town she's never seen before. The young witch of 13, who flies on her broom over the red-tiled roofs of the seaside town, is doing so because a custom among her people requires it, a custom older than any of the people presently keeping it, whose origin has been forgotten in the way origins are often forgotten by the communities that are most faithful in preserving what follows from them. The custom is this, that every witch's daughter, on the night of her 13th year when the moon is full, must leave the home of her mother and her father and fly out into the wider world to find a town that has no witch of its own, and there she must establish herself and support herself, and spend the year learning what kind of witch she intends to become. The custom is softened in the chronicles by the quiet affection that surrounds it. No mother sends her daughter away in anger. No daughter leaves without the packed lunch and the small silver bell for her broom, and the pepper shaker full of her mother's particular herbs. The departure is observed with the same tender ceremony that attends all the great gentle partings of family life, and the moon is very bright above the garden, and the neighbours come out onto their porches to wave, and the small black cat who has been the daughter's companion since her own kittenhood rides in the basket at the front of the broom because she would no more be left behind than she would be left out of breakfast. The country over which the young witch flies on the night of her leaving is a country that resembles, as the castle's country did, a wish made of Europe, though a different wish, and a different era, the wish this time being for a kind of Mediterranean coastal town that exists more in the imaginations of those who have read about such towns than in the geography of any particular map. The town she chooses, after drifting for some hours above lesser candidates, is a large, bright seaside city whose white clock tower rises above red and ochre roofs, and whose harbour holds a long row of moored sailing boats, and whose trams rattle through narrow cobbled streets, with the cheerful commotion of a place that has not yet decided to be entirely modern. She descends rather clumsily into the early morning traffic, nearly causing a small collision, and she stands in the street in her plain black dress with her small black cat in her arms, and she realises that she has no idea what to do next. That the flight itself has been the only part of the adventure she had been able to imagine in advance, and that the actual business of beginning a life in a strange town is a matter about which she has no instruction whatsoever. What the chronicles preserve with particular gentleness in the weeks that follow this rival is the small accumulation of ordinary difficulties by which a new inhabitant of any town comes to belong to it. She cannot find lodging. She's refused by the first 2 innkeepers she approaches. She's taken in at last by a young pregnant woman who runs a bakery with her husband, and who offers the young witch the small unused attic room above the bakery, in exchange for a small service the young witch performs almost without meaning to. The returning of a lost pacifier to a customer's child by a short easy flight that the baker's wife observes with quiet delight. The attic is dusty. The window looks out over the harbour. There is a narrow bed and a washstand and a beam from which the young witch hangs her dress at night, and within 2 days the attic has become a home, as attics have a way of doing for 13-year-olds who have decided to let them. She establishes, after some thinking, a delivery service, the only magical skill she possesses in any reliable form being flight, and she begins, on a borrowed telephone, to receive orders from the people of the town for the carrying of small parcels from one address to another, across the hills and harbours of the city. Her work is not glamorous. She carries a black cat who does not always approve of her route choices. She's knocked about by unexpected wind. She loses a stuffed toy that has been entrusted to her, and recovers it. Through a small adventure she does not tell her clients about, from the corner of a forest where a young artist lives in a painted caravan and keeps her own company. She's paid modest sums in the currency of the town, and she begins to save a little, and she learns, in the manner of all 13-year-olds who have been given a small livelihood to manage, the particular satisfactions of earning and the particular anxieties of having earnings to lose. What the chronicles understand about the country of this act is that its largeness is not the largeness of forests or of spirit worlds, but the largeness of the ordinary in the eyes of a person who is encountering it for the first time on her own responsibility. The bakery downstairs with its warm yeasty mornings and the baker's wife's patient round belly and her steady encouragement. the elderly woman up the hill whose oven is broken on the afternoon a herring pie has been promised to her granddaughter, and whose kitchen, with its careful handwritten recipes and its brass weights, and its flour sifted patiently through a wooden sieve, opens to the young witch the door of a kind of magic she had not been taught to recognize, the quiet magic of care extended from one generation to another through the medium of a particular pie on a particular afternoon. The boy in the neighborhood who has fallen in love with her, in the inarticulate lurching manner of 13-year-old boys, and who follows her at a distance on a propeller contraption he has built himself, and whose devotion she receives with the puzzled politeness of a 13-year-old girl who has not yet decided whether she wishes to be loved in this way. The painter in the caravan in the woods who becomes, across a single long conversation, the older friend every young person needs at a particular moment, the friend who has made the passage into her own kind of vocation a few years earlier and who can speak without condescension about what the passage entails. The difficulty that arrives in the middle of this otherwise sunlit year is the difficulty the chronicles treat with most care, because it is the difficulty that the custom of the year abroad is ultimately designed to address, though the custom itself does not admit this openly. The young witch loses, for a period of weeks, the ability to speak with her cat. She loses the ability to fly. Her magic, such as it had been, simply withdraws from her, leaving her in a state of spiritual perplexity for which none of her practical training has prepared her, and she stands at the window of her attic in the evenings, looking out at the harbour, and she cannot understand why the gift that had come so easily has left her so entirely, and she does not know how or whether it may return. The chronicles are careful, here, not to explain the loss in any single way. They suggest that it is the sort of loss that happens to every young person who has lived. For a stretch of time, on a gift that arrived before it had been chosen, and whose relationship to that gift must at some point be renegotiated on the terms of the choosing self. They suggest that it is also the simple exhaustion of a 13-year-old who has been supporting herself in a strange city for a number of months, and who has been, without realizing it, pouring out her resources faster than she has been replenishing them. They suggest, most gently, that it is nothing more than a winter of the spirit that must be lived through rather than cured, and that the practices by which it may be lived through are practices already available within the young witch's life: the making of bread with the baker's wife, the painting of a portrait of herself with the artist in the caravan, the long, slow walks through the town without any particular errand, the permission to be, for a while, a small tired 13-year-old who is not required to be a witch every hour of every day. What returns her flight, in the end, is not a lesson learned, but a crisis that demands it. The boy who has loved her at a distance is in danger above the harbour, clinging to the ropes of a runaway airship, and the young witch, who does not stop to examine whether her magic has returned or not, takes up a brush borrowed from a street sweeper and leaps into the air and finds, in the act of needing to fly, that she can, that the magic has been waiting for her on the other side of the emergency, and has in fact been there all along, available in principle but not available for examination, and she plucks the boy from the ropes and settles with him, shaken and alive, onto a rooftop in the late afternoon sun. What the chronicles record of the rest of her year in the city is recorded lightly, as small glimpses rather than full narratives: a letter written to her mother, a line of laundry stretched across the attic window, the baker's wife giving birth to a small pink infant whom the young witch holds, in an afternoon sunlight that falls just so across the blankets, with the particular cautious awe that 13-year-olds reserve for newborns, the cat finding a grey partner of his own in an alley, the slow establishment of a life that belongs now to the young witch rather than to her mother, a life she has built out of her own resources in a town that has made room for her, and that she will carry with her in some form into whatever comes next. And so the young witch hangs her dress by the attic window in the warm, quiet evening, and the listener may carry her small, bright courage forward into a different country, where a young woman in a blue dress is standing at the railing of a flying ship, watching a small crystal pendant glow with the light of a country that no longer exists on any map of the world below. The young woman in the blue dress who stands at the railing of the flying ship is not a young woman in the usual sense, being only 12 years old, though her composure and the steadiness of the hand that holds the crystal at her throat give the impression of someone older, someone who has already passed through experiences the 12-year-olds of the ordinary world have not yet been asked to bear. The crystal itself is the chief of her inheritances, this small pale blue stone set in a simple silver mount, worn on a chain around her neck since the death of her mother, who had worn it before her, and her mother before that, in a line reaching back further than any of the chroniclers of this country have been able to trace. The stone is called, in the old tongue of her people, by a word that translates only approximately into the common speech as the stone that remembers, and it has, through most of her short life, been a quiet companion, warm against her collarbone, unnoticed by the world at large, and of no interest to anyone beyond the girl who wore it. The country that the flying ship crosses is a country that resembles, as several of the earlier countries resembled, a corner of Europe that never quite existed. A country of long, green valleys, and terraced farmland and small mining towns, strung along the sides of steep mountains, whose trains run on narrow gauges through tunnels blasted through the living rock, and whose engineers and miners speak in the warm bluff dialect of a people who have been underground together for long enough to make the dark a kind of shared home. But the country is not only the country of the mountains and the mining towns, it is also the country of the open sky above those mountains, and of the airships and ornithopters and aerial pirate craft that move through that sky in a tangled commerce the governments of the ground countries only partially acknowledge. And it is, above all, the country of a legend so old that it has passed out of the category of things that are believed in, and into the category of things that are fondly remembered, the legend of a floating island called by a name that means, in the old tongue, simply, the castle in the clouds. The girl who wears the stone has been taken onto the airship against her will by agents of a government whose interest in her has suddenly and inexplicably become total. Her life, until a few days before the chronicles begin, has been the life of an orphan in a quiet mining village, raised by neighbours and by the memory of her mother, and she has had no indication that the crystal at her throat was anything more than a keepsake until the agents arrived, with their dark suits and their quiet voices, and took her out of her village and onto the ship with a courtesy that did not quite conceal the fact that she was being taken. She does not understand what they want. They are not willing, on the ship, to explain, and so she stands at the railing in the evening, as the chronicles find her, watching the lights of the valleys below and feeling the stone at her throat for the first time growing warm of its own accord, warm with a warmth she has never felt from it before. What interrupts the ship's careful custody of her is an attack by a family of aerial pirates, a large cheerful family led by an enormous grey-haired woman whose sons and grandsons pilot the small ornithopters she has given each of them for their various coming-of-age birthdays, and whose motive in attacking the government ship is only secondarily the girl at the railing, their primary interest being a small silver treasure the ship is reported to be carrying. In the confusion of the boarding, the girl is knocked from the railing by a stray movement and begins to fall, and the stone at her throat, growing fully alive now, speaks its old words of its own accord and slows her fall and lowers her, through the soft night air, through the mist and the moonlight, down into the arms of a young boy who has climbed out onto the roof of his guardian's house, on a ridge far below, and who has been, for reasons he cannot entirely articulate, watching the sky. The boy is, as near as the chronicles can estimate, the same age as the girl who has fallen into his arms, and his life until this moment has been the ordinary life of a village boy apprenticed to an old engineer who runs a small air pump at a nearby mine. He has no inheritance of the kind the girl carries. He has no stone, no lineage, no mystery about his origins beyond the ordinary mysteries that attend any child who has lost his parents young. What he has is a steadiness of character that the chronicles treat with considerable respect, a steadiness that shows itself in the fact that he does not hesitate when the girl falls into his arms, does not call for help, does not attempt to hand her off to an adult, but carries her into the house and lays her carefully on his own small bed and sits beside her through the night, while the stone at her throat cools and dims and finally returns to its ordinary appearance. What follows, in the days that follow, is a pursuit, a flight, and a discovery, and the chronicles move through these phases with the particular care they give to stories in which the younger characters carry more of the narrative weight than the older ones. The pirate family comes for the girl again, and then the government ship comes for her, and the boy accompanies her in her running, and they are pursued through the valleys and onto a train that crosses a single narrow viaduct above a great drop, and they are sheltered, for a time, by the pirate family itself, which turns out to be, after its initial alarming appearance, a great warm household of cooks and mechanics and boys who quarrel over the last slice of bread at breakfast, and a grandmother who treats everyone, including her enemies, with the same brisk maternal affection. The girl learns to mend sky sails. The boy learns to pilot a small ornithopter. They are both, in ways they do not entirely notice, becoming themselves during this flight, the flight functioning less as a chase than as a threshold through which they are passing together, from childhood into whatever comes after childhood. The island in the clouds is found at last on an afternoon when the stone at the girl's throat wakes again and speaks, in the old tongue, the path to the place it has been remembering. The island is not where anyone has imagined it to be. It is above the weather, higher than the ornithopters of the pirates, and higher than the government ships, inside a great still cloud that conceals it from all ordinary seeing, and the stone carries the boy and the girl upward into that cloud as though the cloud had been waiting for the right key to be turned in it. And the island is, at first sight, astonishing. A great green garden grown over the ruins of a technological civilization, where small fox-like creatures and great gentle robots move among the flowering trees tending the quiet work of the place. What the chronicles preserve about the island is the particular quality of its ruin. The civilization that built it was more advanced than any the ground countries have since produced. The civilization that built it also destroyed itself, out of the familiar refusal to set limits upon its own ambition, and what remains is a memorial garden tended by machines that were not involved in the original catastrophe, and that have, across the uncounted years of their stewardship, become something closer to kin of the flowers they tend than to kin of the civilization that built them. There is, at the heart of the island, a great tree whose roots hold the stones of the central palace together, and above the tree the genuine power source of the island, a crystal of a kind and size that make the small stone at the girl's throat look like a chip from its edge. And what the girl learns, standing before it, is that her line is the last line of the island's original people, and that she alone may speak the word that would set its slumbering military machinery in motion. She is not the only one who has made the climb to the island. The government agent who has been pursuing her, a tall, soft-spoken man whose quietness has been more frightening than any loud ambition, is with her on the platform, and he makes, with a courtesy that remains intact even in the moment of his greatest evil, his final offer that together they should use the island's power to set the affairs of the ground countries to rights. What the girl says in answer is not a speech but a single word of the old tongue, and the word is the word that unbinds rather than the word that binds, and the island begins, under her speaking, to release its hold on its own weapons and its own ambitions, to let its technological apparatus fall away into the clouds, to return itself to the one thing its builders' children had been wise enough long ago to encode into its deepest programming. The instruction that if the island's power were ever to pass beyond the control of those who could use it gently, the island itself should remove that power from the world. And so the weapons fall, and the great crystal releases its light, and the island rises further into the upper sky, carried by the roots of the great tree and by the small attentive robots, and by whatever older force had been holding the island together through all the waiting centuries, and the boy and the girl descend in a small glider into the clouds below, holding hands, watching the green heart of the island rise above them into a height where no airship will follow. They return to the ground countries, and they are welcomed by the pirate family, and the girl is no longer the last of her line in the ordinary sense, because the line itself is now concluded, her inheritance spent on the quiet, correct choice to let it go. She keeps the stone, which is only a stone now, warm against her collarbone. She and the boy part and meet again, and go on meeting in the years that follow, and the chronicles do not pretend to describe the particular shape their lives take after the island rises beyond reach, because the chronicles understand that the shape of the rest is less interesting than the shape of what has already been chosen. And so the island rises into the upper sky, and the boy and the girl settle back into the ordinary countries below, and the listener may carry their quiet descent forward into a different and heavier country, where two young brothers walk through the rubble of a burned city, carrying between them a tin of fruit drops that will not last the winter. The two young brothers who walk through the rubble of the burned city carry between them a tin of fruit drops that is, at the moment the chronicles find them, already more than half empty. The elder is 14, the younger is 4. They are walking westward along the edge of a road that the fire has left largely unrecognisable, past the blackened frames of houses that had, a few days before, been houses, past the small, careful heaps into which the surviving neighbours have begun to gather the belongings that were salvageable and the belongings that were not, past the bodies of those who had not reached shelter in time, covered now with whatever the salvagers had been able to spare. The city behind them is the great seaport of the island nation in the last months of a war that has consumed the country it belongs to, and the fire that has left the city in this condition is not the kind of fire that burns out of neglect or lightning, but the kind that is delivered, from very high up, in patterns designed to ensure that nothing within the delivery zone will be left unburned. The chronicles of this country are the gravest the listener will be asked to walk through in the course of the whole journey, and they ask a particular patience of anyone who approaches them. They do not contain any pleasant reversal. They do not contain any spirit who will descend from a cloud to set right what the war has undone. They contain instead the quiet, precise record of 2 children who had, until the fire came, been loved children in a comfortable household by the sea, whose father had been an officer in a navy that was, in the weeks before the chronicles open, being defeated in a long, slow way across a great ocean, and whose mother was a woman of gentle health, who had not been well for some time before the fire, and who is, as the chronicles quietly note, no longer alive when the brothers set out along the ruined road, though the elder brother has not yet explained this fact to the younger, because he cannot think of a way to explain it that a 4-year-old will be able to hold. The road leads them, in the first days, to the house of an aunt in a smaller town further inland, a woman who takes them in with the correct civic propriety of a householder, receiving displaced relatives during a national emergency, and who provides them, for a time, with the bare provisions her rationed household can offer. The chronicles are careful with this aunt. They do not make her a villain in the simple sense. She is a woman under enormous pressure, whose own household is shrinking into the same privation that is shrinking every household around her, and whose patience for 2 additional mouths that belong to a brother she had never been especially close to wears thin in ways she does not trouble to conceal. She begins, by small steps, to remark upon what the brothers eat. She begins to remark upon what they do not contribute. She begins to sort their mother's salvaged kimonos in front of them, into piles for barter on the black market, and to describe, with a precision that is not exactly cruel but is not exactly kind either, how much rice each garment will be worth in the arithmetic by which her household is presently being held together. The elder brother, who has been, throughout the walk from the burned city, the protector his younger brother has required him to be, receives these remarks with the composure of a 14-year-old who has decided that he will not burden his 4-year-old brother with the grown-up disappointments the aunt's household has begun to represent. He takes the brother out into the garden after meals. He invents small games for him from whatever the garden offers, a bent nail, a smooth stone, a colony of industrious ants that can be watched for an hour at a time with genuine absorption. He carries the younger brother on his back up a small rise from which the river may be seen, and he points out to him the particular patterns of the swallows in the evening, and he tells him that their mother has gone to a hospital for a while and will come back when she is better, which is the story he has decided the younger brother is not yet ready to hear the end of. And the younger brother, in the way of very small children who are fiercely loved, receives all of this without suspicion. He trusts his elder brother with a trust so complete that the chronicles record it as one of the purest things they have ever been asked to preserve. He makes small observations in the voice of a child who has just acquired a number of the more difficult words. He loses his fruit drops one by one down the front of his shirt and rediscovers them as small gifts to himself. He sings the nonsense songs his mother had taught him before her illness, and he sings them without any awareness that they are the last songs he will ever learn, and the elder brother listening memorizes them without meaning to, so that when the younger brother is no longer singing them, the songs will remain somewhere in the elder brother's head, too small and too private ever to be sung again. The arrangement with the aunt eventually becomes untenable, and the elder brother, with the particular resolve that sometimes comes to adolescents at the end of their patience, takes his brother and what remains of their possessions, and walks out one afternoon along the path to an abandoned shelter at the edge of a pond on the outskirts of the town. The shelter is a simple concrete structure, half buried in a low bank, originally dug as a refuge from the air raids the war had promised. Inside there is a single raised platform, a cold hearth, and a wooden shelf upon which the boys arrange the few things they have brought with them, a blanket, a photograph of their mother, the tin of fruit drops which is by this point almost empty. There is a stream nearby that they use for water. There is a garden at the edge of the abandoned shelter in which a few vegetables have gone to seed. There is a sky above the pond in the evening that fills, as the summer deepens, with the small silver lights of fireflies, and the brothers, on their first night in the shelter, catch a great handful of the fireflies and release them inside the mosquito net the elder brother has strung above their sleeping place, so that the younger brother, lying on his back, sees for the first hours of that night a sky of living stars that belongs only to him. The chronicles stay with this shelter for the bulk of their accounting. They do not accelerate, they do not skip forward. They insist, with a kind of patient refusal to flinch, that the listener walk with the brothers through every day of the summer, in which the shelter becomes their whole country. The fireflies die within a day of their catching, as fireflies do, and the younger brother digs a small grave for them in the dirt of the shelter's floor and asks without looking up whether his mother is also in a grave somewhere. And the elder brother, caught unprepared by the question, tells him the truth, which is that she is, and the younger brother absorbs this information with the calm of a 4-year-old who has been, for some time, half aware of it already, and the two of them sit together beside the small firefly grave in the warm summer afternoon, and they do not cry in the showy way of older grief, but only quietly, together, in the way that very small children and the people who love them most sometimes do. The food in the shelter runs out before the war does. The elder brother steals from the fields and kitchens of the surrounding farms what he can steal without being caught, and when he is caught, the beatings he receives are described by the chronicles with the same quiet patience they have applied to everything else. The younger brother grows thinner. The elder brother, who has been giving more of his share than he has been taking, grows thinner also. There is a doctor, briefly, at a clinic to which the elder brother carries his brother on his back along a road, lined with other desperate families doing the same thing, and the doctor examines the younger brother and speaks words the elder brother has already known in his own heart, that what the child needs is food, and there is no food to be had, and the elder brother carries the child back along the road to the shelter with the last of his strength, and lays him on the platform beside the nearly empty tin of fruit drops, and sits beside him through what the chronicles record as his last conscious hours, and sings the nonsense songs back to him in the same voice in which the mother had once sung them, and the younger brother smiles at a bent nail he is pretending is a piece of cake, and closes his eyes, and does not open them again. The elder brother does not survive him by long. He cremates his brother himself, in a small careful rite he has seen performed for others, and he places the fruit drops tin with the ashes, and he walks, in the final days of the war, into a railway station in the city from which they had first fled, now half rebuilt, now full of other displaced children, and he sits on a stone pillar with the tin on his lap, and the chronicles, with the same restraint they have maintained throughout, record only that he closes his eyes, and that the station continues without him, and that a cleaner discovers the tin in the morning and, not understanding what is inside, throws it into the tall grass at the edge of the platform, where the ashes catch on the wind and are carried outward over the fields that are, by then, already beginning to grow green again with the small, stubborn resurrection that the earth undertakes whenever the wars of its people permit it the chance. What the chronicles ask the listener to hold at the close of this accounting is not the weight of what cannot be undone. They ask instead that the listener permit these two brothers to be remembered, which is all that is required of any of us in the presence of such a story, and to be remembered as they were in the middle of the summer in the shelter, the elder pointing out the swallows, the younger singing the nonsense songs, the fireflies rising in their brief bright country above the pond in the evening, a pair of small figures held in a love that was not able to save them, but was real, entirely real, for every hour it lasted. This is what the chronicles preserve. This is what the listener carries forward. And the war ends, as wars eventually do, and the countries begin, as countries eventually do, to become something other than the countries that made the fire, and the small stubborn green that covered the ashes that August continues, in its slow way, beneath all the later weather of the island nation, carrying within itself, among many other things, the memory of two brothers who walked a road together for a summer. And so the green returns to the fields, and the listener may carry the weight and the tenderness of this remembering forward into a gentler country, where a young woman rides a train through a rice paddy at golden hour and looks out at her own 10-year-old self sitting in the seat across from her. The young woman who rides the train through the rice paddy at golden hour is 27 years old, and she's travelling to the countryside alone for the first time in her adult life. And the chronicles of this country begin, as they begin for so many of us, with a question she has not yet learned how to ask in words. She has taken a long weekend from her office job in the city, an office job of the kind that was common in the last decades of the 20th century, in which young unmarried women were employed to perform the polite administrative labour that allowed larger decisions to be made by people who were not asked to perform it, and she has arranged to visit a farming family to whom she has some distant relation, to help with the harvest of the safflower crop that the family has tended on a small mountain farm across the many generations of its existence. She does not, at the start of her journey, have any particular reason for the visit beyond a vague dissatisfaction that she has not yet examined, and a vague memory of the countryside from a single summer of her own childhood, and she carries with her a small suitcase, a sensible jacket, and a feeling as she boards the train that the weekend is meant to be a brief practical escape rather than the long, slow turning point it will in fact become. The country through which the train carries her is the country of the island nation, in the middle years of its long post-war reconstruction, a country that has rebuilt itself, in the great cities, with remarkable speed and considerable success, but whose smaller places have been allowed to quieten year by year as the young people left the farms for the offices and the old crafts yielded by small attritions to the convenience of industrial supply. The rice paddies she passes are still worked. The small wooden houses with their grey tile roofs are still lived in. The safflower fields on the mountain she's travelling toward are still cultivated by the family whose name has belonged to them for longer than any of them can reliably trace. But the country around these persistences is thinning, and the young woman watching it through the window of the train feels this thinning the way one feels a change in air pressure, without quite being able to say what has changed. What the chronicles introduce in the compartment of the train is a presence the young woman has not invited. Across from her, in the facing seat, a 10-year-old girl in a white blouse and a plaid skirt has been, for some distance, watching her with the patient, steady regard of a child who's not interested in being polite. The girl is, and is not, a stranger. The young woman, looking into the girl's face, recognises the face gradually, the way one recognises, in the mirror, the features one remembered from a photograph of one's own childhood. The girl is her own 10-year-old self, and she has come to travel alongside the young woman on this journey for reasons the young woman does not yet know, and that the 10-year-old girl, in the way of 10-year-olds, is not in any hurry to explain. They regard each other across the little table between the seats, and the train moves on through the countryside, and neither of them speaks for some time, and the silence between them is not awkward, but patient, the patience of two people who have all weekend to understand why they are here. What follows, through the days of the harvest and the nights in the small upstairs room the farming family has given her, is a quiet conversation between the young woman and the girl who was, a conversation that happens in memory rather than in speech, that surfaces in the middle of ordinary tasks, that illuminates the young woman's present life in ways she is not asked for but cannot ignore once the conversation has begun. The girl arrives with her memories intact. She remembers the classroom in the 5th year in which a small boy had asked her, with unexpected directness, whether she was finding the work on fractions difficult, and how the asking had unsettled her, in ways she had not then been able to name. She remembers the particular summer in which she had refused to eat pineapple, and the elaborate family negotiations that had followed, and the way she had eventually come to eat pineapple again on her own unforced terms. She remembers the failed audition for the school play, and the first letter she had ever written to a boy, and the single persistent small fear that she had not, in some way she could not specify, become the kind of person she had expected she would become. The young woman, holding the scissors with which she cuts the safflower blossoms from their stems in the cool early mornings on the mountain, finds these memories surfacing without warning, and finds herself, for the first time, attending to them rather than moving past them. The farming family among whom she works has taken her in with the warm, unembarrassed hospitality of country people who have already decided that they like her. The young man of the family, a farmer in his late 20s who has chosen to stay on the land his siblings have left, walks with her in the evenings along the paths between the paddies and speaks to her about the crop and the soil and the weather, and asks her, with a seriousness that surprises her, about her life in the city and whether it satisfies her. And she finds that she is, without having prepared for it, answering him more honestly than she has answered anyone about these questions in several years. What the chronicles understand about the conversation between the young woman and the girl who was, is that the conversation is not in fact a reckoning of regrets, though the young woman, in her less patient moments, attempts to make it one. The girl does not accuse her. The girl does not ask why certain ambitions were abandoned or certain opportunities left untaken. The girl is, it turns out, simpler and more interesting than that. She is the person the young woman has been before she began to perform her own life for the satisfaction of other people, and her presence is not a rebuke but a kind of company, a reminder that this earlier self is still available, has in fact never been lost, is walking alongside the young woman at every moment, and will continue to do so whether the young woman chooses to acknowledge her or not. The realization the young woman arrives at, on her last morning on the mountain, is not an epiphany in the dramatic sense, but the settling of a long, slow question into an answer she has been circling for years. She has been living, she discovers, a life she did not consciously choose, and she has been waiting, without fully admitting it to herself, for a reason to choose something else. The farm does not require her to stay, and the young farmer does not require her to stay, and the girl who was does not require her to stay, and yet the weekend has given her, between them, an image of a life that could be made out of different materials than the materials her city life had been made out of, and she finds, on the train back, that the image will not release her, that it has the particular weight of a truth rather than of a fantasy, and that the question before her is no longer whether to change, but how and when. The girl who accompanies her only to a certain point on the return journey, and then, without any ceremony, is gone from the seat across from her, leaving behind the seat itself and the small table and the field of rice passing again outside the window in the gathering evening. The young woman does not weep at the departure. She does not need to. The girl who was has given her what she came to give, which was not a verdict upon the past but a permission regarding the future, and the young woman carries the permission forward into the life that will follow the weekend, which is a life we need not describe in detail here, because the chronicles understand that the particular shape of what she chooses is less important than the fact that the choosing, at last, is hers. And so the young woman sits in the quiet train carriage in the long yellow evening. And the listener may carry the gentleness of her remembering forward into a country of still gentler textures, where two small sisters sit on a rainy afternoon, listening to their grandmother tell stories about a house that once contained another child, a child they have never met but whose presence fills the old house in ways they are only now beginning to notice. The two small sisters who sit on a rainy afternoon, listening to their grandmother, are not, in the ordinary sense, the characters of this particular chronicle, though they appear at the edges of it as the listeners who preserve its telling across the generations. The chronicle belongs properly to the woman their grandmother was when she was a child, and to the particular summer she spent in a small countryside house when she was 10 years old, in a period of her life she had not spoken of for many decades, and that the asking of her granddaughters has, in the way of the right questions put to the right person, at last called up out of the quiet place she had kept it. The rain on the afternoon of the telling is a gentle summer rain, the kind that the small wooden houses of this country accept without complaint, and the grandmother speaks in a low, unhurried voice, and the sisters, wrapped in a single blanket on the tatami, listen to her with the absolute attention that small children give to stories they sense are real. The country the grandmother is speaking of is the island nation in the years before the war that has shaped so much of the chronicle's larger memory, when the grandmother herself was a small city child of delicate health, and when her parents, anxious for her lungs, had sent her to spend the summer with distant relatives in a farming village where the air was good and the milk was fresh, and the days passed in the particular slow rhythm that farming villages of that era had been able to maintain. The house she was sent to was a modest farmhouse tucked against the side of a low green hill, occupied by a middle-aged couple who had taken her in with kindness, and by an older grandmother of their own, a woman of considerable patience and considerable reticence, whose presence in the household functioned like a steady quiet gravity, around which all the smaller activities of the farm arranged themselves. There had been, the grandmother tells her granddaughters, a particular room in the upper part of the house that no one used, and that had been, for reasons that were not explained to her, kept carefully swept and aired across the years, as though waiting for its occupant to return. she had been given a smaller room across the hall. She had understood, in the way children understand such things without needing to ask, that she was not to enter the other room, and she had complied with this understanding for most of the summer, passing the door on her way to bed and on her way down to breakfast, noting the particular quality of stillness that the closed door possessed, and not troubling herself further about it. What had changed in the middle of the summer was a single afternoon of great heat during which she had come in from the fields with a headache and had lain down on her bed in her small room and had fallen into a sleep that had not been a sleep in the ordinary sense but something more like an opened door. She had dreamed of the other room. She had dreamed of it in particular detail, in the specific arrangement of the bedding and the small desk under the window, and the handful of toys arranged on a shelf that she had never seen. She had woken with the details intact in her memory, and she had risen from her bed, and she had crossed the hall in the hush of the afternoon, and she had opened the door of the other room, and she had found inside it, exactly as she had dreamed, the room she had not in her waking life ever previously entered. The grandmother pauses here, the granddaughters listening with that particular breath-held quiet that small children produce when a story has moved onto ground they are not quite sure is safe. She continues. She had sat down, she tells them, on the edge of the bed in the other room, and she had looked at the toys on the shelf, and she had understood, with a clarity that had not frightened her in the way she might have expected such a clarity to frighten her, that the room had belonged to a child who had once lived in the house, and who had died in the house many years before, of an illness that the grandmother's adult understanding had later determined must have been something like the illness the grandmother herself had been sent to the countryside to avoid. The child had been a girl of roughly her own age. The toys on the shelf had been the girl's toys. The bed she'd been sitting upon had been the girl's bed, and the grandmother, being a child, had not felt the coldness or the fear she would later understand she might reasonably have felt, and had instead felt, sitting there, a quiet, companionable presence, as though the girl who had been were present in the room in some softened form and was not sorry that the grandmother had come. What had followed, across the remainder of that summer, had been a series of small encounters the grandmother describes as the quietest and strangest of her life. She had returned to the room on afternoons when the house was empty and the heat was great, and she had played the careful small games the other girls' toys required, and she had spoken sometimes into the empty air in the voice a child uses with an imaginary friend, except that the grandmother had not been sure, then or later, whether the friend was imaginary or whether the friend was simply very quiet. The older grandmother of the household had, one afternoon, found her coming out of the room. She had not scolded her. She had only looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that the child had not been able to read, and had then turned away, and the matter had not been spoken of between them, and the door of the other room had continued to be closed except when the grandmother herself opened it. At the end of the summer, when she had been called back to the city, the older grandmother of the household had given her a small wrapped parcel to take with her, containing one of the toys from the shelf, a small wooden doll in a red kimono, which the grandmother still had, which she now produced from a drawer beside her, and which she laid on the tatami between her own granddaughters, and which they regarded with wide eyes and careful hands, recognizing in the old carefully mended wood the presence of the story they had just been told. The grandmother tells the sisters, as the story closes, that she had returned to the house only once, many years later, as a grown woman, to find it vacant and the family moved away, and the room at the top of the stairs empty in the ordinary sense, rather than in the sense it had held during her summer. She had walked through it, she said, and had felt nothing in particular, and she had understood that the presence she had known that summer had not been tied to the place itself, but had been something smaller and more private, had been in fact perhaps the particular capacity of a 10-year-old heart to hold company with another 10-year-old heart across any distance the universe might set between them, and that the capacity itself was the thing worth preserving, was the thing she wanted to leave with her granddaughters now, in the form of the little wooden doll and the telling of how the doll had come to her. The granddaughters turn the small doll between them in the lamplight, and the rain continues its soft, steady falling outside, and the country around the old house settles into the gathering dusk, and the chronicles close the telling with the same gentleness they have given to all of their other endings, understanding that the point of such stories is not the proof of anything but the carrying of a certain kind of warmth from one generation to the next, the warmth of knowing that the small private companionships of childhood are real, in whatever sense they need to be real, in order to continue to keep us company. And so the small doll rests between the sisters in the lamplight, and the listener may carry the quiet of their wandering forward into a different country, where a boy of 13 kneels in the long grass of an airfield at the edge of a quiet lake, and watches a small wooden aeroplane rise, tilt, and come softly down again, and thinks about the shape the rest of his life may take. The boy of 13 who kneels in the long grass of an airfield at the edge of a quiet lake is doing so on a summer afternoon in the early decades of the 20th century, in a country that is still, at the moment the chronicles find him, a country untroubled by the great catastrophes that will shape its middle years, a country of wooden farmhouses and quiet mountain paths, and the sort of afternoon light that seems, to those who remember it afterwards, to have been longer and softer in that decade than it has been in any decade since. He is the son of a small manufacturer of machine parts in a provincial town, a father who has provided for him steadily if not extravagantly, and a mother of intelligent and patient temperament who has taken a quiet interest in the boy's particular enthusiasms without attempting to redirect them, and the particular enthusiasm the boy has formed, in the years since he was 8 or 9, is an enthusiasm for flight, for the shapes of wings and the behaviour of wind over those wings, for the mathematics by which a thing heavier than air may be persuaded to travel through air with something approaching grace. He has no talent for the flying itself. This is the particular point the chronicles are careful to establish early in his story. He is a boy of weak eyesight, whose glasses slide down his nose in all but the stillest weathers, and whose small, slight frame has never been the kind of frame that suggests a future as a pilot. He has understood this about himself for some time. He does not regret it. He has discovered, in the discovery that he will not fly himself, the parallel discovery that he may design what is flown, and the making of designs has become, across the long, quiet afternoons of his boyhood, the occupation in which his spirit most fully resides. He has filled notebooks with drawings of wings. He has made small wooden models of aircraft he has seen in illustrated magazines, and, more often, of aircraft that have not yet been built by anyone. He has walked the fields behind his father's factory testing the models into the wind, and he has kept a particular notebook bound in blue cloth, in which he records the performance of each design, with the patient rigour of a child who has understood that seriousness is a thing one must give oneself permission to possess. The country in which his boyhood unfolds is, as the chronicles have already noted, a country at the last part of its long, quiet decade, though the boy does not know this at the time and could not have known it, because the shift of eras is never visible to those living through it in the way it will become visible to their children. The newspapers carry reports of political disputes in places he cannot locate on a map. His father discusses these reports with his mother, in a low voice after dinner, and the boy listens from the next room with the particular attentive inattention that children use when they sense that the adults are speaking of matters they have not yet been invited to understand. The boy's own energies during these evenings are directed elsewhere, into the slow refinement of a single design for a long glider with a double curvature in its wing, a design he's been working on for most of the summer, and that he believes, when he can bring himself to look at his work without wincing, may be approaching the quality his earlier efforts had only been reaching toward. What the chronicles of this act preserve, more than any single event, is the texture of a particular vocation forming itself in a particular soul. The boy is not a genius in the dramatic sense. He is a child of moderate gifts and considerable patience, and his vocation forms itself not through any single moment of discovery, but through the steady accumulation of small attentions across years paid to a subject that is quietly becoming, beneath those attentions, his real life. He visits an aerodrome with his father on a weekend trip to a larger city, and he watches the great biplanes of the early passenger service taxi along the grass strip and lift into the summer air, and he does not, as younger children might, wish to be one of the pilots. He wishes, standing at the edge of the field with his hands on the wire fence, to be able to design what the pilots fly and to design it better than it has so far been designed, and the wish settles in him with the quiet certainty of a vocation claiming its servant. He meets, in the latter part of his boyhood, a particular teacher who has been trained in the mathematics of flight, and who has, by the small accidents of a small-town life, found himself teaching the children of the local school for a modest salary. The teacher recognises in the boy something the school curriculum is not equipped to accommodate, and he begins, with the particular gentleness of teachers who have understood that their calling is to recognize rather than to require, to lend the boy books from his own shelf. Books of equations and diagrams and photographs of aircraft from various countries whose programs were then advancing the art of flight at the steady pace of that decade. The boy reads the books with the attention he's given to his models. He asks questions of the teacher that the teacher is sometimes able to answer and is sometimes not, and the teacher, rather than pretending to the answers he does not possess, tells him honestly when a question exceeds him, and the boy learns from this honesty as much as he learns from the answers themselves. Learns that the edge of what is known is an open country rather than a wall, and that a person who wishes to work at that edge must be honest, first of all, about where it lies. The summer afternoon at the airfield with which the chronicles began returns, in the closing passages of this act, as the image the whole of the story is organised around. The airfield is a modest one. A grass strip at the edge of a quiet lake that a few enthusiasts of the nearby town maintain for the recreational flying of small sport aircraft. And the boy has been permitted by one of these enthusiasts, a soft-spoken man who has noticed the boy's presence at the fence on several Sundays, to bring his own model aircraft and to test it from the open ground beside the strip. The boy sets the model on the grass. The wind rises in the gentle regular way of afternoon wind in that country in that decade. The model lifts, tilts, finds its line, and comes softly down again in the long grass some distance away, and the boy kneels where the chronicles found him, watching the slow descent, and thinks not about the future of his own career, which is still many years from its beginning, but about the particular balance of weight and lift in the double curve of the wing he has designed, and about how, in the next iteration, he might improve it by a small margin that will not be visible to anyone except himself. What the chronicles want to give the listener, at the close of this act, is a sense of how a life is in fact made. It is not made by the great events that the later memory of the life will emphasize. It is made by the long patient hours in the long grass, by the boy kneeling beside the model, by the teacher lending the books, by the father at the factory whose small steady income permits the son the long patience, by the mother who does not redirect the enthusiasm, by the man at the airfield who nods toward the grass beside the strip and says, in a voice the boy will remember for the rest of his life, "Go on, see what it does." The life is made by these small permissions, accumulated across years, and the chronicles preserve them with the same care they have given to the forests and the bathhouses and the burned cities, because they understand that the small permissions are, in the end, what the larger stories are all made from. The boy rises from the grass in the gathering late afternoon, and he walks across the field to retrieve his model, and he turns it over in his hands in the yellow light, and he sets off back toward the town along the path between the paddies, and he carries the model home, and he enters the notebook in the blue cloth with the small adjustments he will make to the next design, and his mother calls him in to supper, and the summer afternoon of the airfield takes its place among the other summer afternoons that the boy is slowly assembling, without knowing it, into the foundation of whatever work he will in the end be remembered for. And so, the boy at the airfield walks home in the yellow light of the long summer afternoon, and the listener may carry the quiet of his gathering vacation forward into a different country, where a girl of 12 flies on a glider across a toxic sea of spores, guided by the smallest insects of a forest that was once a garden and has become a mourning. The girl of 12 who flies on a glider across the toxic sea of spores is the last princess of a small valley that has survived, by a combination of fortunate geography and careful husbandry, the long catastrophe that has emptied most of the countries of her world of their former inhabitants. The catastrophe is 1,000 years old at the moment the chronicles find her. It was begun, in an age whose records have mostly been lost, by the great industrial civilizations that preceded her own, which had, across several centuries of accelerating ambition, developed weapons and toxins of a quality that the earth itself had not been able to absorb, and which had in the end been consumed by the consequences of their own work in a way the chronicles describe with a restraint that makes the consumption all the more complete. What remains of that elder world are scattered small kingdoms like the valley, preserved in pockets of air and water that the poisons have not yet reached, and, surrounding all of them, the great forest of toxic growth that the earth has generated, in the slow patient way of Earth's, to purify itself of what was done to it. The forest is not, in the ordinary sense, a forest that humans may walk in. Its air at ground level kills any living thing that is not protected by specialized equipment. Its trees, which are more properly called by an older name in the girl's language, are enormous and pale and beautiful, and they shed, in their reproductive season, great clouds of pale spores that the wind carries across the remnant kingdoms of the world, so that the small surviving communities live under a constant quiet pressure of contamination, sweeping their roofs each morning, checking their water filters each evening, closing their shutters when the wind is from a particular direction, and watching, with the particular steady vigilance of people who have lived for a long time inside a slow catastrophe, for the first signs that the forest is preparing to move against the valley itself. The insects of the forest are the other great population the chronicles are careful to introduce. They are of many kinds. From the small luminous creatures that fly in drifts above the pale trees at dusk, to the enormous armoured beings that the girl's people know by a name that translates only approximately into the common tongue, beings of great intelligence and considerable emotional sensitivity, whose numbers and whose patience are together the chief defence the forest has built against the small human incursions that continue, across the remnant world, to trouble its edges. The great armoured insects may be, when they are disturbed, terrible, their eyes shifting from calm blue to furious red, their enormous segmented bodies moving with a speed their size does not suggest. But they may also, in circumstances of unusual calm, be quieted, and the girl of 12, who is one of the few humans in her age who has thought to try, has learned, across the careful years of her adolescence, to quiet them, to approach them with patience rather than with weapons, to read the small signals in the movement of their feelers and the colour of their eyes. The valley she rules, though her rule is nominal and is properly held by her father who is ill, is a country of small windmills on a broad coastal plain, of careful orchards of the few fruits that still grow in the purified air, of a gentle people whose long experience of their circumstances has given them a particular disposition, neither despairing nor falsely hopeful, but serious and kind. She flies above them on a small glider of her own design, an engine attached to a light wing, and she moves between the valley and the forest and the neighbouring kingdoms in a pattern of observation and mediation that she has not been formally given responsibility for, but has assumed gradually, because no one else in the valley has been able to assume it with the same degree of seriousness. What enters the careful arrangements of the valley at the moment the chronicles open is a wreckage from beyond, a great ship of one of the larger surviving empires that crashes, burning, in the fields beside the valley one night, carrying within its broken hold an object the empire has been transporting for reasons the girl's people do not at first understand. The object is a dormant embryo of one of the great weapons of the Elder World, a being the ancient records of the girl's own lineage describe with particular horror, a god-warrior of the final catastrophe, which the empire has been preparing to awaken in order to deploy against its rivals. The wreckage brings the empire itself to the valley, in the form of an invading army under the command of a princess of that empire, a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable moral damage, who has been, across her own difficult life, reshaped by loss into a figure for whom the deployment of the god-warrior represents the last remaining path to the restoration of what she believes she has lost. The girl of 12, whose father is killed in the first night of the occupation, does not respond to the invasion with the anger the chronicles might have granted her. She responds instead with a composure that her own people do not at first understand, and that the invading empire understands even less. She does not ask her people to fight. She does not call for assistance from the neighbouring kingdoms, most of which would not send it in any case. She undertakes instead the slow work of trying to understand what is actually happening, which is a work the other parties to the crisis have not thought to undertake. She flies, on her glider, into the forest itself. She descends in her protected suit beneath the pale trees. She discovers in the deep regions a single small pool of clean water and a single small patch of uncontaminated air, and she realizes in the stillness of this discovery that the forest is not, as her people have believed, the enemy of life. The forest is the medicine. The forest has been, across the centuries, drawing the poison out of the earth into itself, cleansing the soil below by layers, storing the contamination in its own pale trees, preparing the world beneath it for a future in which the human communities will be able to walk again upon soil they have not yet seen. The chronicles do not pretend that this realization is sufficient to solve the immediate crisis. The invasion continues. The Empire's princess continues to prepare her god-warrior. The great armoured insects, responding to the disturbance of their forest by the Empire's activities, begin to gather in numbers the valley has never previously witnessed, moving in a vast patient wave toward the valley itself, intending in the slow, terrible way of such waves to complete the cleansing of the human presence that their forest's slower work has been approaching for 1,000 years. What the chronicles preserve of the final crisis is not the details of the battle that follows, but the single image at its centre, the image the girl of 12 gives her people and the empire and the insects at once when she walks out, in her blue, garment-stained gold with the pollen of the forest, into the path of the oncoming wave, and offers her life in place of the lives of the insects' young that the invaders have disturbed, and is trampled, and is raised again by the insects' slow extension of their own restorative power. Lifted upon the points of their many feelers into the air above the field, like a small figure carried by a great quiet sea. The image changes the forest, it changes the insects, it changes, though more slowly and with more difficulty, the empire and the valley. The god-warrior is destroyed before it is fully awakened by the cumulative small choices of many of the parties present. The armoured insects, their anger eased by the gesture offered them, withdraw into the forest, and the girl of 12 returns walking to her people and takes up again the steady work of the valley's life. And her people understand, as the chronicles record with a particular gentle pride, that what has happened is not a triumph of any side, but a small rebalancing of the long work the forest has been undertaking, a small permission for the remnant world to continue its slow inheritance of a planet that has been healing itself with or without them. And so the valley resumes its quiet life beneath the cleansing forest, and the listener may carry the patient courage of the girl of 12 forward into a different country, where an older king, in a kingdom at the brink of war, meets in secret with a small gentle creature who has arrived at the back door of his castle in the form of a red fish. You've walked through many countries tonight, through forests older than memory and kitchens warm with the smell of simmering broth, through bathhouses where the old gods come to rest, through castles that walk on mechanical legs across the moors, through a valley that has learned to live beside a forest that is healing the world. You have met children who carried weights too heavy for them, and carried them anyway, old women who knew more than they ever said, wounded gods who were mourned even as they were feared, and the steady quiet presences who kept the kettles on and the doors open across all the long evenings of the telling. What the chronicles have wished to give you across these hours was not a map of the worlds, but a feeling of them, the particular attentiveness with which small things have been tended in each of them, the particular patience by which a soul is gathered together again in the presence of miso and rain, and a cat dozing on a warm tatami floor. You may rest now inside that same patience. Let the kettle cool on its stove. Let the wind settle in the long grass. Let the lanterns of the bathhouse burn low in the rooms where no one is walking tonight. The worlds know what they are for, and so, in this quiet moment, do you. Sleep now. You are somewhere safe. The door is open, and the light inside is warm, and you have always been welcome here.